All right, now, so let's continue with the second part of our lecture. This time we shall be focusing the discussion on brainstem reflexes. So there are four brainstem reflexes that will be included in today's lecture. This include the pupillary light reflex, the corneal blink reflex, the gag reflex, and the jaw jerk reflex. Okay, so let's start first with the pupillary light reflex. So this is an autonomic reflex. So this reflex results to the constriction of the pupil in response to light. This is to allow adjustment in the amount of light that reaches the retina. Now, there are two components for the pupillary light reflex. The afferent arm is cranial nerve uh, number 2, whereas the efferent arm is cranial nerve number 3. There are two types of pupillary light reflex, both of which will be discussed today. There's the direct light reflex, and of course, there's the consensual light reflex. Now, let's trace its pathway. So whenever you shine light into the eye, photoreceptors in the retina converts that energy into a nervous impulse that is, of course, transmitted by the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, where the cell body forms what we call the pretectal nucleus. So this would be the N1 for the reflex. Now, eventually, the pretectal nucleus sends out fibers or axons that will innervate with the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So this would be the N2 for this reflex. Now, in turn, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus sends out fibers that will form oculomotor nerve, which is, of course, the efferent arm for this reflex. This synapses with a ciliary ganglion that, of course, eventually innervates the sphincter pupillae. So with the activation of the sphincter pupillae, this results to the constriction of the pupil whenever light is shown onto the retina. This is another diagram that shows you the pupillary light reflex. So there are two types. The first is the direct pupillary light reflex. And then, of course, it is tightly linked to the consensual light reflex. So let's say we're trying to shine light into the left retina. As what we have discussed earlier, the information within the retina is transmitted as a nerve impulse by cranial nerve number 2. This ultimately reaches the pretectal nucleus that relays that information to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus in the midbrain. Now, the pretectal nucleus also sends out fibers that would cross over to the contralateral side and innervate the contralateral Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Now, this crossing over of the fiber is responsible for the consensual light reflex. And in both cases, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, as what we have mentioned earlier, would send out fibers that would form cranial nerve number 3 that ultimately stimulates the ciliary sphincter, resulting to the constriction of pupil. So whenever we shine light here, we would observe constriction of the left pupil. At the same time, there would be a corresponding constriction of the right pupil as well. This example constitutes the direct pupillary light reflex, while this pathway right here makes up the consensual light reflex. All right, the next brainstem reflex is the corneal blink reflex. So this is the involuntary blinking of the eyelids elicited by stimulation of the cornea. And just like the pupillary light reflex, there are two types, the direct and indirect, or otherwise known as the consensual response. So this produces a very rapid response. Takes about zero point 0.1 second to observe the response. And this is actually useful in protecting the eyes from foreign bodies. So there are two components of the corneal blink reflex. The afferent arm is cranial nerve number 5, or the trigeminal nerve, and the efferent arm is cranial nerve number 7, or the facial nerve. So let's trace the pathway again. So we have here the cornea, and of course, this is the brainstem. So whenever we stimulate or touch the cornea, the sensory stimulation of the cornea is relayed by the by by receptors that eventually activate the trigeminal uh, nerve. Now, this trigeminal nerve um, forms the nucleus, what we call the trigeminal ganglion, which is the N1, and then eventually sends out axons that would terminate into the brainstem. Now, its synapses within the trigeminal sensory nucleus that ultimately will send out fibers that will synapse with the facial motor nucleus. So the facial motor nucleus, as what we have discussed previously, forms now cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, which ultimately activates the orbicularis oculi, resulting to the blinking of the eye whenever we touch the cornea. So just to recap, this is mediated by the nasociliary branch of the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve. The temporal and the zygomatic branches of the facial or the 7th cranial nerve initiates the motor response. And this is driven by interneurons that are found in the medulla. So simply put, the corneal blink reflex is activated by activation of the trigeminal nerve, and the response is initiated by cranial nerve number 7. Now, the next reflex is the gag reflex. So this reflex actually protects the oral cavity. So this is an oral protective reflex that is already evident at birth all the way throughout the adulthood. I'm sure some of you have experienced the gag reflex at a certain point in your life. This is an automatic response to tactile stimulus to posterior section of the tongue. So you can actually elicit that yourself. You can try it by stimulating the posterior section of your tongue, the soft palate, as well as the pharyngeal area, and this will result to you gagging. So let's trace this pathway. So the afferent arm for the sensory loop is courtesy of cranial nerve number 9, whereas the motor loop or the afferent arm is includes cranial nerve number 10, cranial nerve number 5, and cranial nerve number 12. So with the stimulation of the soft palate, the sensory information is relayed by cranial nerve number 9. And and it relays that information into the tractus solitarius, which then sends out that information to the nucleus ambiguus. Now, the nucleus ambiguus, of course, forms the nerve that will form cranial nerve number 10 that activates the pharyngeal muscle, resulting to pharyngeal constriction. Nucleus ambiguus also sends out fibers that synapses with the motor trigeminal nucleus that forms cranial nerve number 5 that results to the activation of the muscles of the jaw, resulting to opening of the jaw. And the nucleus ambiguus also activates the hypoglossal nucleus, which forms cranial nerve number 12, which of course activates the muscles of the tongue, resulting to the thrusting out of the tongue. So there's constriction of the pharynx, There's opening of the jaw, and there's the thrusting out of the tongue. This um, combined movement produces the gag that we observe whenever we stimulate the soft palate. Right, so the final reflex is the jaw jerk reflex. So this is the contraction of the temporalis and the masseter when the lower jaw is tapped. So the afferent arc is the 1A motor fibers in the trigeminal distribution, where the center is the mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal, and the efferent mandibular fibers are from the motor nucleus of trigeminal. So just remember trigeminal, trigeminal, and trigeminal. So this is a purely trigeminal reflex. Okay, so how is it elicited? So whenever we tap the chin over here, what we would observe is the contraction of the masseter as well as the temporalis muscle. So let's trace that. So whenever we tap the chin, this results in the stretching of the tendon and activation of the muscle spindles that are located on the masseter muscle. So this information is relayed by the trigeminal nucleus, which of course trigeminal nerve, sorry, that forms the mesencephalic nucleus in the brainstem. That then it sends out fibers that synapses with the motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve, which then in turn sends out fibers that would form the motor division of trigeminal. And this nerve, of course, innervates the masseter muscle, and with the stimulation of the masseter muscle, this results to the contraction of this muscle. Right, so now let's summarize what we have discussed regarding the cranial nerve. So there are 4 that were discussed today: the corneal, the jaw jerk, the gag reflex, and the pupillary light reflex. So what about their afferent arm as well as their efferent? For the corneal reflex, the afferent arm is cranial nerve number 5, whereas its efferent arm is cranial nerve number 7, facial. For the jaw jerk, it's trigeminal and trigeminal. Gag, the efferent is number 9, and the efferent includes number 9 and number 10. And pupillary, the afferent is number 2, cranial nerve number 2, and its efferent is cranial nerve number 3. So that ends our lecture for this topic, and good luck. Thank you for listening.